Okay, welcome to session two in our curriculum presentations for this year. We're going to be looking today at knowledge in the curriculum. So just as a reminder of what we were setting up in our last session, this is the map of exactly what we're going to be doing as a school to develop our curriculum. We're going to start off by devising our curriculum rationale, what we think our subject is for, and then we're going to start to detail what we think are the foundations of the powerful knowledge in our subject, the main headline powerful concepts that lead to and cause all the other concepts and ideas within our subjects. So we summarised last session, we gave our concise outline of why students should study the subject. In our powerful knowledge, we then wanted to come up with the knowledge that opens doors, opens intellectual doors. We presented that in a list, as a mind map, as a table, whatever is good for the subject. And those both are going to go at the top of our curriculum maps once we start writing those. Okay, so let's talk about our session today. I'll give you a second to read this paragraph. You can pause the video. Okay, so I am going to try and persuade you during this session that this paragraph is meaningless nonsense. And I hope by the end it will be pretty clear why I think this is meaningless nonsense. And if it isn't, then we can continue to debate it. But this is essentially what I'm going to argue against. I'm going to argue that if you try to take knowledge out of the curriculum in favour of some kind of skill-based, transferable skills-based curriculum, then you're actually going to prevent students from learning effectively. I just wanted to show you these two images initially. Again, pause the video, have a quick look. And you may remember these from when you're training. Bloom's taxonomy was shown to all trainee teachers, sometimes used as a structure for an entire lesson. Bloom's taxonomy itself isn't wrong. There isn't anything necessarily wrong with it. The problem is that Bloom did not identify it as a hierarchy in the sense that one is more important than the other. When a lot of teachers were trained, they were taught that creating and evaluating was better than remembering and understanding. And when you think about it just for a second, it's really strange to think that, isn't it? A physicist who understands the theory of relativity, the general theory of relativity, or theory of general relativity, rather, there you go, showing I'm outside of my domain. That physicist understands that theory but hasn't created it. So does that mean that that's a lower order skill? Well, Bloom wouldn't have said so, but as teachers, we were taught to get kids past the remember section, even get them past the understand section, because they need to be applying and analysing. And if we don't see that in your lesson, then I'm afraid it can't be a 1. It might not even be a 2. Students must be analysing and evaluating, because those are the higher order skills that are more important than just a body of knowledge. If kids just know lots of stuff by the end of your lesson, I'm afraid that cannot be a good lesson. That's what we were trained to believe. Again, I'm going to try and show you why I think that's a load of nonsense. And I think I mentioned this last session, VAK, visual, auditory and kinesthetic. The idea here that students learn in a really different way to each other, and so we have to cater to them. We should essentially teach 3 different lessons: a lesson for the visual learner, a lesson for the auditory learner, a lesson for the kinesthetic learner. And if we don't do that, we're not differentiating properly, and so our lesson is a failure. I'm going to again argue that the evidence suggests that most students learn in exactly the same way. And in fact, a knowledge-based curriculum is going to solve both of these problems. We are not going to see knowledge as a lower order skill, and we are not going to believe that students can't learn unless they see something, listen to something, or fiddle with it in their hands. Okay, so we're going to have 3 sections to this. First section, knowledge is power, an ideology that is really, really important and helpful to drive our curriculum. Secondly, we're going to look at applying cognitive science. I'm not a cognitive scientist myself. I'm going to stay very, very carefully within my own domain. I'm not going to stretch too far, but I think there are really important lessons we can get from cognitive science. And then finally, we're going to look at retrieval and memory. Okay, pause the video and have a read of what's on the page. So we're going to teach students this unit about the existence of God. And our head of department says, but it really is, it's more the independence that we want from them. We don't really want them to know about the existence of God per se, but if they can come out at the end of it working hard for themselves, or even working well with a partner, or even critically thinking, that'll be good. Please take a second to think about what that actually means. What does it mean to say we are not really teaching them about the existence of God? We are teaching them critical thinking. Critical thinking about what? Critical thinking is not a transferable skill. If I sit down with a physicist, my critical thinking will be incredibly poor. I will have built up I will have some physics knowledge, but without physics knowledge, my critical thinking is essentially zero. I cannot sit with the evidence in front of me and come to the great theories in physics. I need to enter the domain and I need to learn from the ground up. Critical thinking, when people talk about it in the case of philosophy or the humanities, what they really mean is somebody with a large knowledge base who is able to see connections between different aspects of that knowledge base. So a critical thinker, when it comes to the existence of God, can compare two different arguments and come up with one that is better than the other by analysing them. Okay? Now, you can't do that unless you know a hell of a lot about the existence of God. So the head of department that says this really isn't talking much sense. What they should really say is, I want you to teach them about the arguments for and against the existence of God, and I want you to make sure they know those arguments inside out. Because when they do, they're going to be able to show their understanding, and eventually we might see them doing something that looks like critical thinking. Many people would argue it's not even then using the phrase critical thinking isn't that useful. What they're really doing is philosophy, a domain-specific activity. Okay, so knowledge is power is our sort of ideological perspective. We believe that knowing things is vital and something we should never belittle. Now, why do I say that? When we're designing our curriculum, there are those who have argued in the past that knowing stuff is a lower order skill as per Bloom's taxonomy. That is not a useful way of looking at the curriculum. We just saw with that last example how that might start to lead you down an unfavourable road. As this session goes on, I hope it will become even clearer why we think knowing things is actually really useful. Knowing is not easily distinguishable from higher order skills. As I suggested before, it is very, very, very hard to analyse something or to evaluate something when you don't know absolutely tons about it. But Bloom would actually probably argue something very similar. That's certainly not how Bloom was taught, though. But actually what I'm saying is slightly more radical than that. What we're saying here is that knowing stuff, having facts and information in your head, really isn't worse than being able to create or to analyse. It's just a different thing. If you know a hell of a lot about biology, that's just different to being able to design a biology experiment, right? They are just different fields. Transferable skills as the ultimate purpose of the curriculum is not a coherent goal. If you are saying, we do this curriculum because we want students to be independent, that is not a goal of your specific domain. What a lot of people are really talking about there is character traits, and you can learn character traits, but it's not the primary thing you should be learning when you're learning French. Character traits you will learn through all of your socialization, through everybody that you meet, and through the school's behavior policies, and through the way you interact with your teachers. When you're learning French, you should be learning French. When you're learning biology, you should be learning biology, because that's the most important thing that you can give to your students. That's the most powerful thing you can give to your students. We believe that knowledge can be a great equalising force. So if students know a lot, and when we select a curriculum that promotes equality and decolonises the curriculum, it can be the kind of curriculum that can equalise the injustices that we see in society. Okay, what do we mean? I keep saying domain specific, so let's make sure we know exactly what I mean by this. Knowledge is domain specific. We mentioned this a little bit last time with our powerful knowledge. Powerful knowledge within your subject is only within your subject. We cannot get to domain-specific knowledge by going out into the street and just hoping to find it. You're not going to find grammatical rules when you walk around in the street. You need to be taught them explicitly. Skills and knowledge are tied up together. It is useless to try and separate them. To try and talk about analysis without talking about knowing things first is pointless. And to say that, oh, it's a shame they weren't analysing, starts to lose its meaning. What we really should be thinking about is, when are we expecting students to receive new knowledge, and how are we going to plan for it? That'll be a much better question than when are they going to analyse or when are they going to evaluate, because it will always beg the question, evaluate what? So the broader our knowledge base, the easier it is to perform a certain skill. We are going to get to this when we look at cognitive science in a second, but the more you know about something, the easier it is to perform these other skills that people talk about. And in fact, it's essential. So what we should be looking for is a broad curriculum in which we expect students to learn a lot of things, to memorise a lot of things. Because when you memorise lots of things, it's then way easier to start evaluating and comparing and seeing connections. Can someone be outstanding at analysing poetry without reading very many poems? Well, if you follow the skills line here, where you say it's a purely skills-based curriculum, a curriculum for the 21st century, you'd say, well, the most important thing is you teach a student to evaluate, then they can evaluate a poem, then they can evaluate a physics theory, then they can evaluate anything. So really, it's not teaching the poem that's important, it's teaching the skill. But that's not really the way it works, unfortunately. If you want to be really good at analysing poems, you need to read loads of poems. And anybody who is very good at analysing poems will tell you that that is true. If you want to be really good at physics, you have to do a ton of physics. And that's because you are developing this complex schema in your memory bank, in your long-term memory, that will then help you to process. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Can you be outstanding at interpreting adverts if you haven't seen any adverts or many adverts? Again, these skills are not really what they say they are. Transferable skills don't really exist per se in education. You have transferable character traits, which we should try and teach students, resilience, but transferable skills across these domains really doesn't have much evidence for it. Okay, so that's our ideology, that knowledge is power, knowledge matters, knowledge is important, and it is domain specific. It is within our specialist subject. We should not look to teach skills that go across different subjects, because it will often just fall flat. The less you know about a topic, the worse you are at using those skills in the topic. Let's have a look at our cognitive science. Now, this is the bit that I really, really, really enjoy. It's one of the things that's transformed my teaching since I started to understand this. Once you really get this into your head, no pun intended, you will start to question almost everything you do and to improve everything that you do. Okay, I'll give you a second to take in this diagram. Pause the video. So, this is a really, really helpful image from Oliver Cavioli, who does quite a lot of presentations on cognitive load theory and on how to sort of present things to students visually, dual coding. This is relatively simple. We take in information from the environment. We listen to it, we see it, we taste it, etc. On thinking about it, when we pay attention to it in our working memory, we can start to put it into our long-term memory. Now, as it goes into our long-term memory, we then remember it, and it goes back into our working memory, and we get this cycle going of learning it. The more that we learn something, then remember it, then learn it, then remember it, the more fixed it becomes in our long-term memory. So, for example, the Second World War started in 1939 and it ended in 1945. That is in my long-term memory. Why? Well, because I learnt it once, I remembered it once. Then I learnt it again, then I remembered it again, and I learnt it again, and I remembered it again. And eventually, it entered into what we call automaticity, which is when I can instantly recall it without using any effort. Okay, so you might think this is just a little bit of science. I'm not sure how this is important for teachers. Let me demonstrate why this is so important for teachers. Willingham, Daniel Willingham, who wrote a fantastic book on the way that cognitive science and education should interact, he says that memory is the residue of thought. Memory is the residue of thought. When we think about something, it goes into our memory. So our attention, when we are paying attention to something, that is when we start to remember it. Memory here is essentially what we mean by learning. When you can remember something, you have learnt it, whatever it might be. If you can remember something incredibly complex, remember something incredibly simple, you have learnt it. So we learn something by paying attention to it. Again, doesn't sound particularly controversial. Our working memory, the thing that processes the environment continuously, is really, really small. It is incredibly limited. It can only hold between 4 to 7 items. That changes quite a lot. There's quite a lot of controversy about that research, but the controversy lies around, some people say 6, some people say 7, some people say 3 or 4. But it's around 4 to 7 items. You can do some very simple experiments on this for yourself. You can write down 7 different numbers and see how many you can remember just by briefly glancing at them. And you will see that it gets to around about 4, 5, 6 before you can not remember them very easily. Our working memory then is really, really, really small. And there's good reasons for this. If we remember everything that we see around us and we don't just bin it, then we will end up paying too much attention to too many things, and we won't be able to see threats. So this doesn't vary significantly between individuals. Our working memory is relatively standard. There are some individuals who have a vastly larger working memory, but not very many. All of us will be in the 4 to 7 category. It can quickly become overloaded, particularly when a novice is confronted by something unfamiliar. As soon as we get past that 7-item limit, we cannot deal with it. We have what's called cognitive overload. We reach our cognitive load. Now, when you have in your long-term memory a really complex set of what we call a schema, a complex set of information all tied together, you can actually ease the load on your working memory. So in this long-term memory, which is theoretically limitless, nobody's managed to find someone whose long-term memory is so full that they can't learn one more thing. So long-term memory is utterly enormous. It contains everything that we know, everything that we can remember, everything that we can that makes us who we are. And this is the most important bullet point. It reduces the strain on our working memory. So if you have a complex schema in your mind developed, then you are able to process something faster. Now, I want you to get ready, and you're going to say everything that you can remember from this image. I'm going to show it for 5 seconds. Okay, pause the video and say out loud everything that you remember. Now, for most of you, you're probably going to say 3 or 4 things. You might get cricketers. If you knew that they were cricketers, if you didn't even know they were cricketers, you might not get that. Now, I'm obsessed with cricket. I absolutely love cricket. When I look at that, what it does is it keys in to this complex schema in my mind, and I instantly don't need to think, oh, there's Michael Vaughan with Ian Bell and Andrew Flintoff, and there's Zach Crawley celebrating a century, and there's Duncan Fletcher. I don't need to think that because I know all of those names. So what I can focus on is what they're doing. I can focus on the fact that Michael Vaughan is hugging Andrew Flintoff from behind. I can notice that Ian Bell is wearing a helmet, and so he's probably fielding at short leg. I can notice that Zach Crawley's holding up his bat, so he's probably just scored a century. All of that can be instantly processed by me, not because I'm a special learner, but because I have a complex schema for cricket. Partially because I selected the images as well, and I've gone through this presentation a couple of times. But the point still stands, that when you do not have to have this strain, because you have a bank in your long-term memory, you can then process something much faster and in a much more complex way. So cognitive load theory says our working memory is limited. Just to prove that I wasn't joking there, that was, or I wasn't lying rather. Those are the images that you were seeing before. Cognitive load theory, our working memory is limited. The more developed the schema in our long-term memory, the lighter the load on our working memory. So if we can have then a bank of knowledge in our long-term memory, we will be able to process things much better and much faster. What does this tell us? Well, I'll just give you a second to read these two important things that we can do as a result. And pause the video. Okay, so we need to break down our subject content. It means that we should not be presenting everything at once. We should be breaking it down. And then we should present our instructions really, really clearly. There is a reason why in my presentations I always use animations. And it's because I do not want to overload the cognitive load of my audience. If every single slide, as I'm going to show you in a second, is incredibly complex, that is going to overload our audience. Take a second to look at this slide, please. Pause the video. Okay, so now you have all planned lessons that look like this as the title slide. You might even think this looks nice. I like this. This is a good start. I think this is really confused. I think this tires my brain out. And I designed it. I can't take all 4 images in at once. I don't know what each of the 4 images are telling me. I've got different font types. I've got a different font type in the title. I've then got so many bold and unbold and different colours that my brain is having to work so hard. Did you actually read any of it when I flashed it up? Because I bet your brain was already getting close to that limit that you didn't really start to take it in. What I'm going to propose is that when you really understand the way that humans take in knowledge, this should be what your slide should look like. And when you start to think about it, why the hell are we putting so many colours everywhere? Why the hell are we putting so many images everywhere? What do we want students, think back to this diagram here, what do we want them to pay attention to? If paying attention is what is going to get our working memory working and moving things into the long-term memory, we better be attention fascists. And this is what I think it was Adam Boxer, who's an excellent science teacher, who argued that we should be attention authoritarians, attention fascists. We should be obsessed with attention and we should try to control student attention. So instead of having a slide that looks like this, where you don't know where their attention is and you're directing it in multiple different ways, do this. Simple picture to give a little clue as to remind students to cue into their schema. This is what praying is, and then simple question. So when we talk about a schema or plural schemata, we are talking about this. Take a second to take that diagram in. So the word house in all of our minds is the part of a complex schema, a really, really complex schema, actually. You'd be able to go way more complex than this. The word house means so many things to us. So what that means is that when we're watching a program about a house on TV, we're not thinking, right, house, what is that again? House is, what does a house look like? And our working memory starts to become overloaded. We don't have that. We can immediately start to pay attention to other things. Students often have no schemata at all within our domains because they haven't studied French before or they haven't studied psychology before. Experts like us have well-developed schemata. And we have well-established connections between those concepts. The reason why teachers have become obsessed with transferable skills is because we see the connections between subjects. Because we have complex schemata. I know quite a lot about geography because I'm just an adult in the world. So to me, the idea of analysing something, I can see the connection between geography and history. So obviously we should teach students how to analyse because then they'll be able to do what I can do. But what we forget there is that I didn't get that complex schemata by jumping the gun. I got the complex schemata by learning from the ground up. So in order to develop this schemata for a house, you'd have to teach students about, well, what can houses be made out of? Well, initially they're made out of wood. What are houses for? Well, you might have meals there. Who with? With the family. You might have a kitchen. What other rooms would you have? And so that's how you develop the schema. Students often come to the topics we teach with no schema at all. And that, if I could get you to really understand one thing today, or take home one thing, it would be that. Remember that our students are not arriving with that complex schema that is in your head. It is not there. So you have to go back a step and create the foundations for their understanding. We should chunk. And to chunk means to break down a concept and to teach it step by step from the beginning. This will then avoid overloading their working memory. And that is the most important thing here about schema. If you can understand that it is our job to develop it from the start, to slowly broaden it and make it more complex, then you can avoid overloading the working memory. Okay, you will all be familiar with the phrase, a rabbit out of a hat. So he's taking a rabbit out of a hat, which is to surprise the audience with what is in the hat. I'd say probably one of the more frustrating things to see when you're observing a lesson is when the teacher says, right, who wants to guess why the First World War started? Anyone? Hand goes up. Is it because there were machine guns now? It's a nice guess, but not quite. Anybody else? Is it because the weather was particularly nice? No, that's a less good guess, but anyone else? What is the point of asking students to pull the rabbit from the hat, or rather to guess what's in the hat, and for you to then pull it out afterwards? That kind of teaching used to be seen as really positive, because what you were getting students to do was to engage and to think for themselves. But actually, those students don't have a schema for how the First World War started. So there's no point. They don't know it. So once we accept that we are subject experts with domain-specific knowledge and developed schemata, it should change how we teach. Asking students what's in our head and then pulling the rabbit out of the hat is inefficient and pointless. Maths teachers don't do this, and MFL teachers don't do this. You wouldn't stand up in an MFL lesson and say, right, who wants to guess how you say holiday in Spanish? There's no point. They don't know how to say holiday. So you need to be the one who gives them that knowledge, and then you need to carefully design what they learn next. How are you going to make that schema more complex? So what should we be doing then? What's a better metaphor for what we should be doing? I'm going to argue that it's Tracy Island. So if you remember in Blue Peter, well, you might not remember. I don't, to be honest. I think this was before my time. Tracy Island was the sort of the Thunderbirds base, and they used to show the final product. And they said, like, this is what we're going for. And then what they did is they said, this is exactly how you make it. And they stood in front on the screen and they said, right, take a toilet roll, take a piece of sellotape, take a piece of cardboard, go and get a bottle of washing up liquid. And they did it step by step by step. They said to the students, you don't have a developed schema for how to make this, but I'm going to take you step by step through exactly how to get there. They said, here's one I made earlier. And then after showing them that final product, they went step by step by step. They modelled precisely how to do it. It's worth saying here that Rosenshine and cognitive science go hand in hand. Rosenshine is actually drawing on that field. And so when Rosenshine talks about modelling and chunking and doing things step by step for students from the beginning, it is linked very closely to what we're arguing here. I want to give you an example from my teaching. So I used to teach the Rwandan genocide at my last school, and I used to teach it incredibly badly. This is how I used to teach it. 6 lessons looking at the possible answers to who caused the Rwandan genocide, or what caused it. And so we'd start off by going, Belgium caused it, or the Hutus caused it, or the UN caused it, or colonialism caused it. And so we would have this one-off lesson where we'd say, right, let's have a look at another group that could have caused it. Now, at the end, they had to write an essay. So we got some students that wrote an essay, and some of them could do it relatively well. A lot of the students who came to the lessons with quite a lot of prior knowledge, a lot of the students couldn't do anything. I'd say probably the most common question I got asked towards the end of the course was, who are the Hutus and who are the Tutsis? It's probably the most common question that I used to get asked. Oh, okay, what's the name of the country again, sir? Rwanda. Okay, brilliant. That was lesson 5 or 6 that you'd get that one. When did it happen, sir? 1994. Right, okay. So the reason why that was such a dreadful way of teaching was because it wasn't sequenced carefully for a student with no schema. So what's better then? Timeline, context, key terms. Where is Rwanda? When did this happen? What was the first thing that happened? What was the last thing that happened? What was everything in between? What keywords are we going to use? What do they mean? How do they fit in? Who are the Hutus? Who are the Tutsis? Where do they live? Then, what happened first? Well, Belgian colonisation. Next, independence. Next, the interim period. Then, the tensions between the Hutus and the Tutsis. And finally, the UN response and the global response. Everything in a sequenced order. At each stage, questioning back to check that they've remembered the key terms and they've remembered the prior lessons so that they can move on to the next step. Everything in chronological order as well. In the end, a 30-question knowledge quiz. I wanted them to know all of that information. And once they know all of that information, if someone says, well, who was to blame? They can say, well, it's complicated, actually. Some people would probably say Belgium. Other people might say the UN. But the most important thing at the end of this way of teaching it is they knew a lot about the Rwandan genocide. And I was never asked again who a Hutu was and who a Tutsi was. Okay, knowledge is power and cognitive science. We've covered those two so far. We've got our final section, which is retrieval and memory. So how are those two related? Retrieval practice is doing the rounds. It's a very sort of in vogue word at the moment. And I actually think it's pretty good that it's in vogue. I wasn't taught about it when I was training at all. We must plan for knowledge acquisition and retention. I wish somebody had told me when I was training that students remembering stuff is what I was after. I wasn't after them demonstrating that they could write a paragraph to a 4A level or a 4C paragraph, or that I needed to get my 4C students to 4A. I wish they'd said to me, make sure that they remember all of this in 6 weeks' time. Because when we start to plan for memory, we start to plan a lot better. We realise that our recall tasks at the start of lessons are vital and that they matter and that they should be diagnostic. If students have forgotten lots in that recall task, then we need to reteach it. How do we do it? Well, I'm going to talk through a couple of ways of doing it. You've got interleaving, as I just mentioned, recall quizzing. You sequence your topics. I'm going to do an entire session on interleaving and sequencing, so I won't go into that now. Cold call in lessons, so not taking hands up from students as often as we might see in a normal classroom, but actually cold calling as a way of sampling. Again, there'll be a later session on that. And knowledge organisers, which I want to talk about briefly in a moment. So we should be teaching for memory. We should plan the things we want students to remember, and then we should test them. We should quiz them regularly. Low stakes quizzing. We're not talking get this wrong and you get a detention. We're talking, I want to check that you've remembered what we did last time. Here's 10 questions. Oh, you forgot question 6, 9 and 10. Right, let's remind ourselves then. It's that kind of teaching where what students remember becomes very important to us. Much more important than whether they can write a paragraph to a 4B standard, as we used to say. Because if they could write a paragraph to a 4B standard and they didn't know very much, then that isn't a good curriculum, is it? That's not us actually delivering powerful knowledge. That's us delivering a sort of bastardized version that ends up with the tail wagging the dog, where our assessment is what matters, not what we teach. Knowledge quizzes as starters is a really, it's becoming standard across the profession, and I think that's as starters there, I should say starters, and I think that's Rosenshine's influence there, and I think that's really important. Knowledge organisers I'll talk about in a second, and self-quizzing I'll talk about in a later session. Give students time in lessons to practice retrieving knowledge. Say to them, right, I want you to go back to last lesson, and I want you to read it through for a couple of minutes, and then I'm going to test you again. It's that kind of understanding that retrieval, the process of trying to go back into your memory to remember something, is really vital for learning. So what is a knowledge organizer? Pause the video and take a second to look at this. Okay, so this is a knowledge organizer for a topic on mission to the moon, obviously, or an Apollo mission, and on Apollo, the one that actually got to the moon. Is that Apollo 11? Not sure, can't remember. Don't have a very developed schema for that. So this is actually from a primary school, and I thought that was quite an interesting one to use here, because I reckon quite a few secondary school teachers would look at this and say, whew, that's a very detailed document. Students aren't going to remember that. They can. Trust me, they can. What is a knowledge organizer? Well, a knowledge organizer is all of the most important knowledge for developing a schema for that entire unit. Everything that they must know. It's the knowledge that if you could press a button, it would be automated in the students. If you get it all down there and say, well, look, if only they could know that, that would be the core knowledge for this topic. That's what a knowledge organizer is. And now what you do is it's a bit like Tracy Island. You write it all out and you give it to them. And you say, look, guys, there it is. There's all the knowledge. That's what you must know. And then you tell them to learn it. And then you quiz them on it. And then you tell them to learn it again. And then you quiz them on it again. And why do you do that? Well, because you know that it's the best way of developing a complex schema for the topic that you are teaching. And you know that the more they pay attention to that knowledge, the more likely it is to go into their long-term memory. The more time they spend retrieving it, the more likely it is to go into long-term memory. So why use it? Well, it's all of that most important knowledge. We're no longer hiding. There's no rabbits in hats here. We're saying, there you go, guys. That's everything that you would really absolutely need to know for this unit. It's worth drawing attention here, by the way, that this is what a textbook is. So I think as a profession, we forgot that a textbook is actually a wonderful invention. A textbook is a knowledge organizer in a different format. I mean, a lot of these knowledge organizers tend to be very, very, very condensed. Textbooks are just slightly more extended versions of knowledge organizers. They are explicit representations of our internal schema. They are really useful to design, because when you do make them, you realise what the core knowledge is. So this teacher has realised that there's a timeline, there's the crew, there's quotations, there's facts, and there's vocabulary. Those are the core things in this unit. Anything else is going to have to be taught separately. So this is the core, most important stuff. And then it's clear what the students must remember. You've made it really, really crystal clear for them. They'll have to learn other stuff on top of this, but the stuff that they must remember, again, think back to our cultural capital and powerful knowledge, they must remember this information. We've made it explicit. So if retention matters, if it matters that students are retrieving this knowledge and then retaining it and keeping it and learning it, we need to ask more questions. We need to work out whether students know the answers to lots and lots of questions. Imagine teaching this unit. You'd stand up for 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, and say, right, I want to know the definition of Apollo 11. Go. I want to know what happened on July the 21st, 1969. Go. And you would zip round the room and see how much of this knowledge was in students' heads. In so doing that, you would start to test and to see if they had developed that complex schema yet. You would ask, as I was just doing there, fact-based questions constantly. Anyone who's taught A-level students knows that they have a wonderful ability to forget the most basic things about a topic. Now, they're not being lazy. They simply don't have the schema. So it is drifting out of their memory because they haven't got things to hook it onto. So what you need to do is to double check, right, have you got the definition of Marxism? Have you remembered who Weber is? Have you remembered what an interpretivist believes? And constantly ask those fact-based questions. They can be in the form of a quiz. Comprehension questions are really, really important. Whenever I'm planning a lesson now, I always plan in at least 2 or 3 comprehension questions from the central text that I'm using. They are not old-fashioned, by-rote, terrible Dickensian teaching. They are actually a way of telling students, or you gauging whether students understand something. And so they are a really important tool. So we're planning for knowledge acquisition using those, and then we should also teach explicitly. And I'm just going to have a quick word on that now about clarity of explanation. Are you the guide on the side or the sage on the stage? So this is what was said to me when I was teaching in my first school, when I first started teaching. I was always a 3, so I was always a 3 at Ofsted. Not actually from official Ofsted, but from the internal observations at the school. Whenever they came to see me, I was a 3. My mentor and best mate at school was also always a 3. He got the best results in school. And what he did is the students came in, they sat down, they started working immediately because he had the work on the board. And he stood at the front and he explained things to them. And then he asked them a ton of questions to see if they understood. And then he moved on to the next bit. They took more notes, he explained more things to them, he asked them a ton of questions. And then he used to set them questions and he used to mark them. And he used to get a 3 every time. So I copied his style because I thought I want great results and I don't really care about Ofsted gradings. And one time, the deputy head came to me and said, well, look, are you the guide on the side or are you the sage on the stage? And my answer was, I'm the sage. By the way, if you don't know, the guide on the side is what you're supposed to be, what you were supposed to be. You were supposed to be facilitating learning. So you were supposed to be allowing students to discover learning for themselves. You were not supposed to be just giving them knowledge, because that was in some way dictatorial. And according to some learning theorists, it's not the way learning works. My argument is that we are the sages. You are the expert. You've been to uni. You've been teaching this subject. You know the information. You have the schema. And so you're the one that understands the internal logic of this subject and all of those connections. So when you are teaching it, you are the sage. They are novices. They don't have developed schema. The reason why my mentor's lessons worked is he recognised that. You don't know anything about GCSE sociology. So I'm going to teach you, but I'm going to start from the beginning. What does sociology mean? It means this. Right, you, tell me what sociology means. It means this. Not quite. You, tell me. Right, good, that's better. That is developing a schema from the ground up. So a sage needs to break the content down into constituent parts and then explicitly teach it. So I want us to flip that advice that I got there, and I want us to take pride in being a sage. Yes, I am. I mean, being a sage is a bit cooler than being a guide, I think. So what's our summary for today? Teaching facts and knowledge is not a lower order skill. So if you remember that paragraph about with 21st century, we need to be teaching transferable skills rather than a body of knowledge. Well, if you don't have a body of knowledge, you're just not going to know anything, and you're not going to be able to use these transferable skills per se, because they don't really exist. They only exist because of your body of knowledge. So teaching facts and knowledge is really vital. Our working memory is limited. Cognitive load theory suggests we should chunk our content carefully. We should pull back on our PowerPoint slides, get rid of any unnecessary colour, get rid of any extra images, unbold, ununderline as much as we can, and put the simple thing that we want students to focus on. That's the thing we want students to be paying attention to, and therefore that is the thing that will be going into the working memory and hopefully into the long-term memory in the long run. Students are novices. They have less developed schemata than us, and so we have to teach them from the ground up, explicitly, step by step. And we should teach for memory. We should use retrieval practice to ensure students remember what we teach. If they don't remember what we teach, then we have failed. Then there is no point in us having taught them in the first place. Okay, so we've now covered all those 3 sections. The next session, there is something missing from this session. You've seen a couple of times, I've kind of skirted over this, which is sequencing. It's tied up in all of this, in all of this theory. It's essentially the argument that you've got to work out the best order for your knowledge. That is what the next session is going to be on. I hope today was maybe slightly controversial, but also interesting. Thanks for listening.